Yamini, I think you can start now.
All right. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening in Delhi, or rather this evening in India and this morning in DC, for what promises to be a very, very exciting conversation. It's an absolute privilege for me on behalf of CPR to welcome all of you, but particularly to welcome Vinay, who is a distinguished alumni of the Center for Policy Research. Uh, 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 Vinay spent some years of his PhD at CPR and distinguished himself not only for his high quality scholarship, but for achieving the impossible at CPR, which is to find himself his own room. There was a time, actually it continues to, thanks to COVID and work from home, rooms are no longer a prime property at the center. We do debate crucial issues of policy, no doubt. We are a serious bunch of scholars, but it all has to be done in a room. That really is the primary arc of our disputes and debates at CPR, who's able to access a room quickly and fast. And Vinay seemed to have managed to do that with quiet charm, so much so that even under the eagle eye of our Chief Administrative Services officer, Mr. Ravi, he managed to find himself a rather comfortable spot, all to himself, with coffee arriving at the press of a button, in ways that even I as president haven't quite managed. And a lot of this, Vinay's ability to have achieved the impossible has to do with his rather charming and friendly personality. And I have to say that in the years since, Vinay has honed his skills as a wonderful scholar and an important biographer of key political personalities in India, and is shedding such important light on crucial moments in contemporary Indian history. But he does it by applying precisely that charm, because he's able to befriend you before you know it. You're talking to him about deep, dark secrets. He also, by the way, has a love for gossip, which is the foundation of our scholarly friendship. But he beats me to his to gossip, I have to say, which is a skill too. And you see this very well displayed in Jugalbandi, the book that we are going to discuss today. But what makes Vinay's charm and ability to land grab in ways that most of us haven't yet mastered, and to collect gossip, is that he doesn't quite just leave it at that. He's able to craft this gossip into a narrative with a storytelling panache that is another thing I'm rather envious of. As I read through Jugalbandi, I read through moments of history that I have lived through, that I have studied, well aware of, and yet he's able to tell his story with the kind of theater and big moments that leave you wondering. It's almost like reading a mystery story, even though you know where it's all going to end. So he brings all of these skills and then layers it on with this wonderful scholarship that gives you such a deep insight into where we are today as a nation, how our history has brought us to this particular point in the trajectory of our nation, one that truly needs to be debated from a historical perspective, and from a much deeper understanding of the evolution of the ideas, through the prism of the characters and the politics that has brought India to this particular moment. Vinay's thesis, beyond the wonderful juicy gossip that he produces as he explains this thesis, provides a very provocative and powerful argument on the complex relationship between the evolution of Hindu nationalism and democracy. It provokes, it challenges, and I think it pushes us to engage in a deeper debate on the idea of India, which is why it's such a privilege for us to have Sunil here to discuss and debate Vinay's thesis in Jugalbandi, to give us a deeper understanding of how Hindu nationalism evolves within the parameters first of the Nehruvian consensus, but pushes its boundaries slowly and carefully in ways that almost co-opt and build a new narrative into where our present political structure is. Thank you, Vinay, for coming back to CPR and for talking to us about your book. But it's a real privilege to have you, Sunil, here on the CPR platform. It's been a long-standing desire to bring you to CPR, and I was hoping we could do it once you come to physically in Delhi, but Zoom allows a lot. Thank you so much for being here. Sunil, of course, needs no introduction. And I think we couldn't have asked for a better dialogue and debate around the framework. The idea of India still remains the book that gives us a deep understanding of the evolution of the Nehruvian consensus and the challenges that contemporary India presented to it, to converse and dialogue with Vinay to help us better understand India's current political moment. So I'm going to, with that, hand over to Rahul Verma, my colleague at the Center for Policy Research, who's leading our work on politics, who will moderate this conversation. We'll start with a short presentation by Vinay, followed by comments and a discussion with Sunil, into which Rahul and I will no doubt contribute as we go along. We will have some time for questions and answers, so please feel free to use the Q&A box as you go along, and Rahul will find a way of summarizing your questions and placing it to both the speakers to respond. Thanks, and over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Yamini. Vinay and I did our first Jugalbandi over, I think, Misal Pav or Vada Pav.
Yes.
A decade back. So thank you, Vinay, for writing this book, especially through the lens of political leadership, and especially like your last book also on P.V. Narasimha Rao, because I think in political science, and especially in Indian politics, what we have been missing is to understand political evolutions and politics through the lens of leadership. And in that sense, what we have been doing at CPR for at least this year, we had a roundtable on political leadership in the beginning at CPR Dialogues, a couple of panel discussions on why leaders are important. So it very well gels with the CPR's agenda. And I think we sort of like look forward to your first presentation on this, and then Professor Khilnani's intervention and everyone else. So over to you, 7 to 8 minutes. Please summarize with juicy gossips.
Thank you very much, Rahul. Precisely because of this reputation for reveling in gossip, I dressed up formally today, and I also have a bunch of arguments. But since the two of you have unveiled me, so I think I'll just try to convince you with some of the arguments. So let me just spend about 7 minutes telling you three of the more provocative arguments, because Yamini and I have discussed this, that sometimes the media attention on a lot of the bylanes that I explore in this book obscures in some sense how I'm arguing against the existing scholarship. In some sense I'm confirming it, in other ways I'm arguing against it, right? Can you all see the PowerPoint? Okay. So this is the book that I've just written. And before that, as Rahul said, I wrote a biography of Narasimha Rao. That was a classic biography. In this case, I began thinking about writing a book on Vajpayee because I'm a child of the 1990s. So the two ghosts that kind of shaped my growing up was liberalization. I remember standing in line for the first McDonald's that opened up near my house in the mid-1990s. And in some sense, the Narasimha Rao book was trying to answer the political story behind that question. The other big theme of the 90s growing up was the rise of the BJP. And so I began looking at this book, and I began thinking about writing a biography of Vajpayee, actually. I then very quickly realized that Vajpayee was only half the coin. The other side was Lal Krishna Advani, and that there was something within the dynamic of Hindu nationalism itself which requires an orator and an organizer. So it begins with Shama Prasad Mukherjee, youngest vice chancellor of Calcutta University, English speaker, to be the orator of the Jan Sangh, the precursor party of the BJP in parliament in the early 1950s. And his Jugalbandi is Deen Dayal Upadhyay, dhoti wearing, Hindi speaking, RSS organizer. Now, many of you who are working on India are familiar with the phrase Jugalbandi. But just to kind of elaborate, a Jugalbandi is a musical concert that has two distinguishing features. Feature one is that it's different musicians typically playing different traditions or different music, right? Yet they manage to make music together. It's not a duet. And second, it's a profoundly equal music. It's not that one is the main performer, the other is an accompanist. And I look at the 6-decade relationship of Vajpayee and Advani, the yin and the yang, the ups and downs, to tell the story of Jugalbandi when it comes to the BJP itself. To give you just one teaser about what I found fascinating about this relationship, all of you who have worked in India know that India is a hierarchical society. We take that hierarchy even when it comes to modern organizations. In college and school, we have this concept of senior and junior. You know, if we join the bureaucracy, which batch you are from means everything. And then even 30 years later, if you're quote unquote superseded, you know, that's an Indian phrase, by somebody from a junior batch, you will resign rather than bear the humiliation of serving under somebody who was once your junior, right? In this context, you have a situation where from 1968 to 1986, Vajpayee is the boss of political Hinduism and Advani serves under him. In 1986, the RSS demands that Vajpayee step down as president of the BJP. And from 1986 to roughly 1995, as the party takes a more radical direction, Advani is the face of the BJP and Vajpayee serves under him. Once again, in 1995, as the party requires to have a more moderate face, it requires to attract coalition allies to form a stable government in power. It's Vajpayee who is boss and Advani serves under him. To have not one but two switches in hierarchy has, to me, no precedent in a modern political relationship, let alone a hierarchical modern society such as India. And that's what I found was fascinating. Now, this argument of the Jugalbandi of Vajpayee and Advani, in some sense, is the argument of the movement itself. And one of the things that I say that is new in this book is this particular causal argument. Step one, that as you can see, the BJP rarely splits, right? It split once in a while. Shankar Singh Waghela took a few MLAs to Khajuraho in 1995. It caused chaos in the Hindu nationalist movement, a chaos that ends finally when Narendra Modi is parachuted as Gujarat chief minister in 2001. But that happens rarely, right? So what you see as quote unquote Congress culture, where the Congress regularly splits, MLAs are kind of shepherded to holiday resorts, never happens in the BJP. Or let me rephrase that, rarely happens in the BJP, right? I argue that this lack of splitting is because of an ideology of unity, what I call Hindu Fevicol. Those of you who are not familiar with Indian idiom, call it Hindu super glue. Fevicol just means super glue, right? And the ideology of organizational unity is itself derived from a certain reading of history. From a very early age, the RSS teaches its young that at key moments, Hindus, which is for them the same as Indians, were defeated in battle because they backstabbed each other, right? Because they didn't work together. The point is not whether this historical lesson is true. In many cases, it's a simplification. The point is that that historical lesson, repeated ad nauseum at RSS shakhas, translates into an ethic of organizational unity, where RSS and then BJP members feel that even if they disagree with the party, to leave the party, to betray the party, will be to mimic the weakness of the Hindu past. In some sense, that's the core argument of the book. The second argument of the book is a causal explanation for the rise of the BJP. And here I depart from existing explanations by showing you that it was actually demand-driven initially. This is the key, right? That the rise of Hindutva and BJP in the 80s, when it's moving, from a 7% vote share roughly, which it's been since independence, to a 18-20% vote share. This kind of stuff Rahul Verma is excellent at. But what is driving that initially is Hindu anxiety. And that Hindu anxiety, which crystallizes in 1981 in the furor around the Meenakshipuram conversions of Harijans or Dalits into Islam, is driven by 4 factors. Factor 1 is the Khalistan movement, which is targeting Hindus of all castes. And I show you how important or how scary that particular ghost is for ideas of Hindu unity that is believed by Hindu nationalism. Second, the extension of OBC quotas in North India. In South India, you have it from the 60s itself. In North India, it begins to extend in the 80s. And that creates anxiety among upper caste Hindus that there's a split between the OBC and the Hindu vote bank. Third is a fear, now you could argue correct or wrong, that Saudi petrodollars are encouraging conversions in India. And fourth, economic anxiety that is not confined to Hindu nationalism alone, but nonetheless in the early 80s is converted from economic or class anxiety to ethnic anxiety. None of this, by the way, is a creation of the VHP, RSS, let alone the BJP. But at that very time, when there is Hindu anxiety in the early 80s, the Congress is in structural decline, the BJP under Atal Bihari Vajpayee is going in a secular socialist direction. So there is a void for politicians who will cater to the Hindu vote. Into that void, first steps in the VHP and the RSS. The Ayodhya movement in the early 80s is a direct response to that. The first political party that understands this is Indira Gandhi, followed by her son Rajiv Gandhi. And it's only in the late 1980s, 1989 to be precise, that the BJP co-ops radical Hinduism, right? So in that sense, the Rath Yatra is a signal that Advani is sending to his own cadre that I am with you. So that's the causal explanation that I make for the first bloom of the BJP, which is initially demand-driven, and in that it goes against the existing scholarship. The third argument, and arguably the most provocative argument of the book, is what I say is the relationship between Hindu nationalism and elections. I argue that Hindu nationalism is constituted by elections. It's no coincidence that the institutions of Hindu nationalism, whether the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS, or Savarkar's essay on Hindutva, was written in the 1920s. This was the period when you had the first real elections in India. It's limited, of course, but it's the first kind of the closest approximate to universal adult franchise. That sets off panic in a group-based society such as India. Rather than convert into Swiss voters who vote on interest, Indians begin to redefine groups. The idea of a minority and a majority comes in, and Savarkar, Golwalkar, etc. actually support elections, saying that what problem do we have with elections if Hindus are a social majority? The 100-year project of Hindu nationalism is to unify enough Hindus to create a Hindu vote bank, right? And what adds to this is the fact that traditional Hinduism doesn't have an alternate theory of the state, some kind of new Medina or some kind of papal state that can form a counter to electoral democracy. So the BJP and Hindu nationalists are illiberal, they're majoritarian, but they are defined by elections, right? And to just give you a very contemporary example to end my slide, look at what happened in Hyderabad recently, right? For a municipal election, you had Amit Shah, you had the president of the BJP going all the way to win. This makes no sense, right? If they are fascists. This only makes sense if, to quote a BJP leader who shall remain unnamed, he told me, we worship God through winning elections, right? And that's the third and I suspect most controversial part of this argument. I'm going to end now, and I would love comments, criticisms, feedback from Rahul, Sunil, and from the rest of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinay, for that concise presentation and making three sort of arguments very, very clear where this book stands, what are the causal sort of chain which leads to the rise of BJP. Professor Khilnani, Vinay ends his book with this line. It was BJP alone, led by Vajpayee and Advani, who stayed together, that was able to emerge as the national alternative. Their idea of India won because they worked as one. Someone who has written the idea of India and someone who has read idea of India many times, I know in the popular domain, idea of India seems like a singular idea, but in your own book, you do write that the idea of India is actually about sort of allowing multiple ideas to emerge, to contest, and to sort of like be there. What I would like you to sort of like do in next 10 to 15 minutes is juxtapose Vinay's thesis with sort of like what is happening in Indian politics or Indian party system, where we see sort of like a decline of Congress and rise of BJP as a national alternative. And if you look at the last 50 or 70 years of Indian history, what Vinay is essentially saying that in the first 10 to 15 years, Bharatiya Jansangh, when Shama Prasad Mukherjee goes to Guru Golwalkar and asks about his help in forming a political party. So how BJS basically is formed and works with the Nehruvian consensus of that time. Then in the second avatar, which is in 1980s, when BJP is born, and Congress sort of like seems to be playing into the Hindu nationalist agenda or card, allowing certain things, Rajiv Gandhi going to Ayodhya temple and other things. And finally, in 2004, where Vinay's book largely ends, which is basically sort of like end of first NDA government led by Vajpayee. And I remember Professor Suhas Palchikar writing in EPW pages that despite the loss of BJP, what we see that the idea has not lost traction. Majoritarianism is very much present in the ground. So how do you see sort of like this evolution of Congress's decline in these three phases and the rise of BJP, as Vinay sort of argued?
Thanks very much, Rahul. And thank you, Yamini, for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And thanks above all, Vinay, to you for giving us something to think about, discuss, argue about for quite some time. It's a really wonderful book. And I admire your capacity to take complex ideas, rich event-filled moments, and actually weave an incredibly fluent and gripping narrative. It's a really fine book to read, and you sort of discover along the way that you're also learning a great deal, even as you're simply enjoying the pleasure of reading the story you tell. So I really admired what you've done with the book. And I think it does have buried in it some very important insights and arguments about where we are and how we've got here. And I mean, I guess, I think one of the book's merits as well is that it sort of refocuses the attention away somewhat from ideology, which has really dominated a lot of the discussion of recent politics, towards political skills, political learning, and the acquisition of skills to operate electoral politics through trial and error. And in a sense, I want to, I'll just flag here and I'll come back to, I want to focus on what I think you described as your most controversial argument, the third argument, which is about this, as you put it, necessary link between Hindu nationalism and electoral democracy. As you mentioned, the Hindu nationalism emerges during the 1920s, the decade of the 1920s, when we see an expansion of representative politics, representative elections in India. And you argue, and again, I'll come back to this, that there's the Hindu nationalism lacks a distinctive conception of power, comparable, say, let's say, for example, to the Leninist theory of the state, and therefore a theory of the capture of power, how you are to capture power. The Leninist theory of the state has a model of the state and a theory about how to gain power through revolutionary violence and so forth. And in the absence of such a theory, Hindu nationalists, as you put it, as I understand from your argument, simply adopted the electoral game as introduced by the British and made the judgment that the power of numbers promised by elections would ultimately deliver power to them. And you through the book, there is this running theme of, as you put it, the compatibility between Hindu nationalism and elections, electoral democracy. And yet, of course, it's striking that for most of the sweep of the 100 years your book covers, Hindu nationalists were pretty useless at winning elections. It's only, I mean, from the 1920s to the 1990s, they were actually not very competent at doing that. They managed time and again to, in a sense, shoot themselves in the foot. And it's only over the course of the past 30 years that they've actually devised the methods and tools to win elections. And I think what your book helps us to see is how Vajpayee and Advani, through a lot of effort, through trial and error, acquired skills to successfully campaign and win elections. Instead of ideology or even policies. And I think you rightly say, in fact, they were not particularly defined policies that guided them through this period. And you give us a very determinedly political account. It's a rich narrative of how from the early 1980s, the BJP and its family associates managed finally to align themselves with the expressed preferences of the electorate. I want to put some pressure on that argument in the hopes of getting you, Vinay, to clarify some of your views about the relationship between Hindu nationalism and democratic politics. Not just elections, but also the other aspects that we consider to be part of modern democracy. And just to flag some of those issues, it isn't clear to me that there's necessarily a natural fit between electoral democracy and Hindu nationalism, that one will support the other. But I'll set that aside for the moment, because I think that is the sort of central issue in your argument. Let me first just raise some more secondary issues, which I think are questions which struck me in reading your book. As Rahul rightly said, what the focus is, or at least one of the focus of your book, is leadership. And this very interesting situation which obtains in the BJP, where there's a division of labor in leadership for political purposes, for electability, but also for maintaining the common will and coherence of the organization. There's an insistence on organizational unity, as you say, and on clear chains of command, on decisions taken and upheld even when individuals might disagree with them. And yet, at crucial moments in the party's history, as you document, you show its leaders to almost be impotent, unable to control or direct. So, for instance, in 1992 in Ayodhya, on the raised platform where Advani stood, he wasn't able to actually control what his party and movement was involved in. Or in the account you give of Modi in the chief minister's office in Gujarat in 1992, you describe him as somehow, unable to control what was happening. And this splitting of leadership, this distribution of, or this entanglement of the chains of decision-making and command, I think it introduces an element of deniability in the way in which the movement works. It also gives, if you like, perhaps greater control of the organization over leaders, because no one person necessarily, power isn't concentrated in that. And it also, I think, in your account, allows you to absolve leaders of responsibility at crucial moments. And I wanted, to push you a bit on that. It also raises a broader question, which I kind of kept stumbling across while reading the book. Were leaders leading, or were they being led? You quote at one point the late Jayapal Reddy, who said of Vajpayee that, quoting, when he can't beat them, he not just joins the pack, but actually leads it. And so was it the transformation of the electorate over these decades, which which it turned out the BJP was a better gauge of than the Congress, and was able to tailor itself to speak to the anxieties and hopes of the electorate? And you place a large burden of your argument, I think, on what you call the shifting mood of the Hindu voter or the shifting electorate. But you only give a very broad brush account of that. Was the BJP exploiting opportunities created by Congress in the 1980s, or was it pushing them further? Was it actually creating its own constituency? Was it finding effective ways of inventing a Hindu identity which could fit with the requirements of electoral democracy? And here you at the very end of the book you talk about the BJP succeeded in making Hindus vote as one, Hindus being 80% of the population. But of course, actually, they haven't quite done that. You don't even have to look at it that closely to see that 80% of the population don't vote for the BJP. What they have done through this very trial and error acquisition of the skill of winning elections is very careful electoral strategizing to make just enough people in crucial constituencies identify themselves as Hindus in order to win enough parliamentary seats to win a majority. So in fact, as Rahul and you know much better than I, the share of the vote is not a majority. And no, it's certainly not anywhere near 80%. So in a way, I think this kind of reinforces your argument about the learning of electoral skills. But I would have liked to have seen a bit more, or at least I'd like to hear you talk a bit more on how that electoral strategizing worked, how campaigns were actually run, how candidates were selected, on what basis they were selected, what degree of variation or localization of campaigns occurred, all of that. The other, and this was the first argument you highlighted, was, as you put it, this unbending focus on unity, what you call the secret sauce of BJP success. And I guess I also, would like to hear a bit more about that. You mention, you underline this historical narrative that's inculcated, as you put it, into the members of the movement about the dangers of past disunity and how that has to be overcome to keep the party and the movement together. But I wonder, is that really doing all the work? Are there other incentives that are holding it together? After all, you give plenty of examples of internal conflicts and struggles, personal rivalries, differences over policies, and so forth. So what beyond that ideology is actually holding the party together? Is it a party structure that allows talent to rise internally, that keeps avenues of promotion open? Is it centralized control of funding, the way in which tickets are handed out, seats are handed out? What are the mechanisms that produce and sustain this unity? And what are its weak points? And what happens when a cadre-based party is taken over by a single strong leader? What do you see as playing out? Another aspect of your book, which I think you didn't mention in your opening remarks, but I think runs through it, is how, at least during the Vajpayee-Advani era, there was sort of variations on a theme argument that when it came to foreign policy or when it came to economic policy, Vajpayee and bringing Advani along with him broadly followed a kind of consensus view about what should be done, based, as you put it, on Vajpayee's capacity to read Parliament, his sort of deep immersion in the political culture of Parliament, and his ability to read that. And there was one other aspect of this continuity that I just wanted to raise, which I think has now changed. And that was a kind of unspoken, unwritten rule about the arena of religion and politics, about the arena of communalism. I mean, if you look at the period from independence, right to the 90s, really, there was this sense that you would get communal politics, but at the state level. Religion and politics would mix, would be used for electoral purposes, but at the state level. But it didn't seep into national politics. Somehow you kept it out of national politics. It began to change, I think, as you say, in the 80s and much more in the 90s. What you now have, what we now have, is sort of full throttle entry of state level kind of communal politics into national politics. And it's, if you like, a kind of reverse vernacularization. Not so much the introduction of the national into the local with local characteristics, but an infusion of the local into the national. So that earlier kind of continuity, I think, has changed, has broken. And I wondered if your sort of reactions to that. So let me come back to what I think is the central thesis of the book, which is this relationship between Hindu nationalism and modern democracy. And as I mentioned, I think you're very convincing in noting the absence of a conception of power in Hindu nationalist political tradition, specifically in relation to the modern state, an absence of a conception of the nature of modern power in modern democracy. Now, the modern democratic state, or to give it its full, more appropriate title, the modern constitutional representative democratic state. It's a mouthful, but I think you need all those terms. It's a very distinctive, complex, and recent invention. It's only about 250 years old. And what's unique about it is that it's a theory both about the legitimate winning of power, but also about the legitimate exercise of power. And the reason I think we so value and admire the intellectual history and political history of our national movement, and the reason why we keep going back to the decade of the 1940s and the 50s, at least historians and scholars do, is not just because the national movement gave so much thought to winning power, so much thought and effort to winning power, but also to thinking about how to exercise it. And I think this is what distinguishes the Indian national movement from almost every other anti-colonial or revolutionary movement of the 20th century. Those were movements which were designed to capture power, but were completely oblivious about what they would do with that power, how they would regulate that power once they won it. And that's why you see the wreckage of so many anti-colonial nationalist movements throughout Africa and Asia. They got power, and then they simply kind of didn't really know how to run it as a modern democratic constitutional state. And I think that's also what distinguishes the national movement from the tradition of Hindu nationalism, which hasn't had a kind of equivalent reflection on the exercise of power. These other ways of thinking did reflect on how to gain power, but not so much how to wield it under modern conditions. And I think what your book so clearly shows is that, yes, through a lot of trial and error, the Hindu nationalist movement acquired these powerful skills of winning power under conditions of modern electoral democracy. But there's little evidence from the historical record you provide, or I think which could anyway be found, that they gave anything like the same effort to thinking about how to deploy that power once you acquired it. So, the conception of representative democracy establishes the majority principle for winning power, but it counters that with an anti-majoritarian theory about the exercise of power. It's a system that simultaneously creates massive power and it invests that power in authorized office holders and institutions. And it also requires that power to be distributed, subject to scrutiny, critique, constraints. And that just is part of the deal of what modern democratic power is. It's part of the package, the bargain. It's not, you can't just pick out the bits you like, i.e. elections, and say, well, the rest is not really part of it. It's part of what this, unwieldy 4 or 5 letter term to describe it is. And I think what's so remarkable about our own foundational era is that we had a generation of leaders who really got this, who really understood that it was a package, that it wasn't just winning and then you did whatever you could with that power. There was a kind of bargain. They got their heads around the whole package and invented, I would argue, a distinctively Indian form of modern democratic power. And that really, I think, was India's founding consensus. That was the founding consensus, not some imagined agreement about policies and strategies, whether it's economic or foreign policy or etc. So I think in that sense that what's referred to as the Nehruvian consensus is a bit of a red herring. There was never a Nehruvian consensus. There was always massive disagreement about economic policy throughout the 50s, the 60s. In fact, if you look at the newspapers and so on, it's not that everyone was falling in line. Similarly on foreign policy, there was plenty of disagreement about policy. But what there was consensus about was about winning and exercising power according to certain principles, rules, laws, procedures, etc. Now, what I think you show is that under the Jugalbandi you describe, under this partnership between Vajpayee and Advani, the capacity to win power was fully realized. And I think what you also show, and I think this is what's very striking and historically sensitive in your account, is you show that Vajpayee, through his many years of being in parliament, he's sufficiently absorbed, almost by osmosis, and I think more by osmosis than actual intellectual engagement, the culture of democratic politics, of winning and using power. But it was almost like he was miming the part without really fully grasping the philosophy underlying the play, if you like. He'd perfectly learned to play the part without necessarily, and even to speak the lines without necessarily really knowing the underlying philosophy. But I think now what we see is that from his successes, even that capacity to mime the part, it no longer holds. Right? That no longer holds. So that's where we are, I think, where we are. One can say more about the nature of democracy and how that relates to majorities and so on. Perhaps we can come to that in the discussion. But it is just a pragmatic point that one of the underlying necessities of a functioning, of a modern democratic state which can sustain itself, is that it doesn't become trapped in the idea of permanent majorities. Is that it does build into its operations the understanding that winners will sometimes be losers. That you can't keep winning because otherwise the game is skewed and you won't keep everyone in the game. And the only way you can then keep people, as it were, in the game, it's not actually keeping them in the game, but the only way you can keep some sort of social order is through increasing repression. And I think that we can perhaps pick up some of those in the discussion, but I'll stop there. But thank you for this very stimulating set of arguments you've set out.
Thank you, Professor Khilnani.
Thank you, Rahul. Sorry, I interrupted. Can I have a stab at it? What would you suggest?
I think let Yamini also chime in if she has any question, and then you have
No, because there, I'm just taking 3 pages of notes. So if
And
you just give me 5 minutes and then I can take Yamini. Is that okay with you? Yamini? Because there's like, there's like not food for thought. There's a buffet for thought here.
There is indeed. Go ahead.
Sunil, I'll just sort of go chronologically and I'll go reasonably quickly because I think, this is but firstly, this is fantastic, right? And just to put it out there, Sunil gave me the single best advice anybody has given me when I began my PhD, which is think in chapters, right? I've written it down on my laptop, which is that when you have an idea, don't have an idea, right? Think about introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, right? And that's proved really helpful. And even the structure of your criticisms is very helpful because, you have A, B, C, D, E, and it's very helpful. So I'm just going to go chronologically, Sunil. So let me begin with your argument about, that the definition of democracy doesn't square with the way Hindu nationalism thinks about elections, right? And just first up, I agree, right? So if in your description of democracy, both being about winning power and wielding power, the BJP does not fit that definition. There's just no question, right? But the two pushbacks I have is, one is that in a largely group-based society like India, or a completely group-based society like India, what you describe the national movement as achieving seems to be a bit of an anomaly, right? Rather than being representative of how Indians reacted to the introduction of elections. And to just give you evidence of that, look at the Samajwadi Party, the Bahujan Samaj Party, Mamata Banerjee, right? All of them don't share your definition of democracy at all, right? In that they have a theory of how to gain power by constructing various social coalitions, but they don't have a theory of wielding power, of give and take, this idea that, we'll win some battles, we'll lose some battles. They just don't have it, right? I don't even think Nitish Kumar or Biju Janata Dal has that. So in that sense, it could well be that, and this is something that the book doesn't deal with, that your description of the Indian National Congress was a self-consciously elite project, that it wasn't an organic idea of democracy that kind of grew from soil. And this is Madhav Khosla's recent book, that the constitution was a self-consciously elite project. And the aim was that the constitution over time would school Indians in the definition of democracy that you just presented us, right? And I think that has failed. And what remains behind is a much more organic conception of what elections should do. And in that sense, the BJP is not different from most of its competitors in having a theory of constructing social or political majorities to win power without the other aspects of wielding power that you talked about, right? So while I agree with you, it just seems that your description of the national movement seems more the exception than what is today the rule, right? You also make, when it comes to elections, the correct point that here I am saying that, the BJP and Hindu nationalism is defined by elections, but they actually start winning pretty late in the game, right? And that's true. And I think there are two reasons for this. First is, at the state level, Sunil, they start winning from 1967 onwards itself, right? I think in 1977, the Jansangh has 12 states, again, I should check the numbers, where they either have chief ministers or deputy chief ministers. So this electoral rise has been a pretty long time in the coming, especially when it comes to the states of India. I think political scientists mistake the beginning of Hindu nationalism as the 2-seat defeat of the BJP in 1984. Actually, they have a pretty long past. I suspect they would have had an even longer past had Hindu nationalism not been tainted with the murder of the Mahatma, right? In every election, the Congress said, vote mat de do, vote nahi denge Gandhi ke hathyaron ko. And as I argue in the book, Gandhi was the Hindu leader, right? And his assassination by a man who was not from the RSS, in the sense the RSS didn't acquiesce to the killing, but shared the views of the RSS, pushed Hindu nationalism back for at least a decade, right? But nonetheless, your point still holds. And I think the deeper point of that is, despite its obsession with elections, why it requires this organization is that it's a radical ideology, that Hindu nationalism is constructing an idea of Hinduism that is removed from the way Hinduism is practiced in society, right? It's an elite ideology in that sense, right? So all the more power to its emphasis on elections and an emphasis on organization, because it's not an organic reaction to Indian preferences. In that sense, it's taken 100 years to construct Narendra Modi. And so its compatibility with elections goes hand in hand with the fact that it has to construct a social majority where there is none. And in this way, Hindu nationalism is different from traditional Hinduism. Then you ask, again, a very valid question, which is that on one hand, I'm focusing on organization and leadership, but on the other hand, I'm providing you demand-driven explanations, and it's almost as if these leaders are following the pack, right? So you give the Vajpayee-Advani example, but to take the conversation even closer to us, my explanation for Narendra Modi's becoming the Hindu Hriday Samrat is actually demand-driven. That he was an opportunist, he was a new chief minister, and he realized that the organizations of Hindu nationalism had a very, very different view of the burning of Hindu activists in Godhra compared to liberals. And he decided to cater to that constituency, right? So once again, you could argue that by focusing on Narendra Modi reacting to demand, I'm giving him a clean sheet, as it were, right? And that's a really good question. But the thing is, and maybe you're right that there is this inconsistency, but I guess the researcher in me is able to see this demand, right? And is able to see these politicians reacting to the demand. The only question I ask myself, or the importance of leadership, is that when you see a tide in front of you, how best are you able to navigate it, right? Rather than kind of leading the pack. And certainly in the 1980s, that seems to be the case. And to put it out there, while there is Hindu radicalism in the air in the 1980s, there's also Dalit radicalism, right? You have the Bahujan Samaj Party created in 1984. You have Kanshi Ram, an absolutely brilliant theoretician of social reality, constructing a different kind of majority against upper castes, right? Why does he fail? So in some sense, even though the beginning is demand-driven, there's plenty of opportunity for leaders and organizations to make use of that demand and to shape it for their own politics. And my argument when it comes to Kanshi Ram is he fails because he doesn't focus on organizational unity. That he initially has all these deputies who belong to different sections of Bahujan society. He has a Pasi, he has a Jatav, who is of course Mayawati from UP. He has Muslims, he has Christians. But the fact that he favors Mayawati and that Mayawati is a bit of a lone wolf means that this Bahujan ideology, which was a majoritarian ideology that united against upper caste across India, is reduced to the party of one caste in one state, right? So you have an initial demand, but you have leadership and organization that can use that demand. And by no means was it inevitable that the Hindu majority was the only form of radicalism. To give you another example, 80% of India or even more are peasants and workers, right? So when you have, class anxiety in the 1980s, what were the socialists and the communists doing? Right? The communists should have been able to use this leadership and organization to mobilize it. So while the decline of the Congress has a lot of structural factors leading up to the 1980s, the 1980s is an open field for a variety of political entrepreneurs. Why does the BJP win? That's the way I look at it. And that answer is leadership and organization. But you make a valid point, and and in some sense, it does give a clean chit to Vajpayee, Advani, Modi from the charge of top-down communalism, because I say it's a bit of both, that there is demand and there is supply, but definitely demand plays a very big role. So in that sense, I definitely am guilty as charged. The question is, what is the historically accurate answer, right? But your description of my argument is absolutely true. Then you make the argument that when I talk about unity, it's not true that 80% of Hindus vote as one. In fact, even the 39% of Hindus who vote for Narendra Modi in state elections, they may vote on caste, on region, etc., etc. And that's true, right? And to me, the argument which I think Rahul read out is focused on the unity of the organization. So it's Vajpayee and Advani won because they worked as one, right? So it's the unity of the organization, and to some extent, it's the unity of the vote bank. But as you know, Sunil, to win in India, you just need 30 to 35% of the vote share. All of this is Rahul Verma's bread and butter, right? So they just have to convince enough Hindus to vote as one. It can't just be upper caste because that's about 20% of the population. So you need to expand. And they have to make sure that the opposition doesn't unite. And quite frankly, that the BJP does not need to do anything for that. The opposition has proved perfectly competent of making a pig's breakfast of their own ideas of organizational unity, right? But the focus is on the organizational unity, less on the vote bank unity, because for the reasons that you mentioned. Then you point to other incentives to hold the BJP together other than what I call Hindu Fevicol, right? And that's the only thing, Sunil, I'd like to push back on a little bit, because to give you an example, it's not ideology alone. The communists have ideology. The Bahujan Samaj Party has ideology. It's not the RSS, because as you know, the Congress has the Seva Dal, right? Which is a volunteer force, right? It's a joke. I don't think anybody has even heard of it, including people in the Congress. The Bahujan Samaj Party had the Bahujan Volunteer Force. So these are organizations that have ideologies, that have cadres, right? And have fervent belief, and yet they fail. And to me, that just to give you a counterfactual, had Kashiram said to himself that the historical analysis of the non-upper castes in India is that they're always set against each other, right? And therefore, as an organizational form, come what may, I will neither promote myself or my close associate Mayawati. I'll give everyone a chance, because the central focus of the Bahujan Samaj Party must be that the different leaders stay united. That's one way in which the voters stay united. Had he done that, right, and had he used the history of the Bahujan movement in India to be able to do that, you would have a very different BSP. So on that, and you asked me for examples of how the BJP goes about doing it. I have those in the book. But one very strong example, and I'll just give you one example for this answer, is the RSS has this rule that its pracharaks should not be married, right? Golwalkar made that. Why did he do that? Because he said if pracharaks are married, they'll have children. Once they have children, the children will want to join the RSS, and it will become a nepotistic party like the Congress. I don't think the Congress is a particularly nepotistic party. It's just an Indian party. In every sphere of life, Indians, promote their own children. The Congress is no different. The RSS understands this. It's one example of, focusing on unity, allowing people like Narendra Modi to enter because they know they have a chance at the biggest prize. You then talk about, the unwritten rule at the national level, where the arena of religion and politics were different. And you talk about how at the national level, this has changed right now. It was always there in the states, but it's changed at the national level. Once again, I agree with you. And I think there are two reasons for this change. First is Hindu nationalism itself has become more religious. The RSS initially was founded as quote unquote a secular ethnic movement. It didn't have religious figures. It stayed apart from the traditional religious institutions of Hinduism like the akhadas. I point out in the book that in the mid-60s, this changes when Golwalkar introduces sadhus into the anti-cow slaughter movement. But really that's dormant till the Ayodhya movement, where you have sadhus, where you have religious figures. So to give you an example, Yogi Adityanath, who is now the center of the BJP, his sort of spiritual ancestors were always kept at a slight remove from the RSS and the Jan Sangh. And that change within Hindu nationalism from becoming an ethnic movement to also a religious movement somewhat mirrors this change. The other reason I suspect for this change is, you can call it the Gujaratiization of national politics, but is a contingent event that Narendra Modi and Amit Shah have wield this kind of power in the BJP today. Again, it's not written, it's a contingent event. I point out in the book that in April 2002, had Vajpayee persisted in sacking Narendra Modi as Gujarat Chief Minister, we wouldn't have heard of him, right? It's a contingent event. But think about this. Before 2014, neither Narendra Modi nor Amit Shah have done a day's work in Delhi. They don't know parliament. They don't know what the central ministries look like. Their prism of politics is the state legislature in Gujarat versus BJP versus Congress, right? And for the reasons that you mentioned, that is the traditional domain of religious politics. And the contingent event of Modi and Amit Shah wielding this kind of national power has transferred that strain of state politics on the national level. Now, I could go on and on. I think there are two more questions that you asked, but in the interest of time, I'll stop right now. But these are absolutely fascinating questions, Sunil. And for some of them, I genuinely don't have an answer. So I don't want to pretend that the book answers all the questions that you asked.
Thank you, Vinay. Yamini, you can ask your questions, and then I'll sort of like share some questions which has been asked by our fellow audience members.
Sure. Thank you both, Vinay and Sunil, for such an insightful and provocative conversation. Lots of things to say and discuss, but we also have to be conscious of the fact that we are the hosts of this discussion, and all those who are posting questions must be given the opportunity to have their voices heard as well. So I'm going to be very brief and quick, but there were two things that I couldn't help myself from wanting to engage you with you on, Vinay, which I'd be keen for you to reflect on. One is, I think, on the relationship between Hindu nationalism and violence. I think you've sort of engaged with this a little bit, even in your responses to Sunil. and you do give a very you do use the dynamics that are unfolding between the BJP and particularly between the particular leaders that we're talking about and members of the Parivar to sort of to suggest that actually blame can be shifted in different ways. But what you don't do is to engage in is to give us a deeper sense of the dynamics of these relationships and how and whether or not the construction of a context in which blame can be shifted is also part and parcel of being able to create the kind of political mobilization that was necessary, because each of these moments of violence in different ways created contexts where mobilization became difficult, but mobilization also became possible and manageable over a period of time after the immediate aftermath of the violence settles, and they get a sense of how the demand is shifting through that violence. And here there's also a very big shift between the responses post-Ayodhya in 1992 and 2002. In 1992, the violence causes a stuck in some senses for the project of political mobilization of the BJP. In 2002, it actually accelerates, mobilizes, and creates the perfect storm that we end up in, where the BJP ended, or rather reinvented itself in 2014. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from you on this, on the relationship between the Parivar and the BJP, and the ability that that relationship enabled for shifting blame around violence and what that did to its project of political mobilization. Second thing that perhaps we'll have to postpone for another day, but I would really like to think harder about the project of Hindu nationalism and its relationship with democracy much more closely in the context of the steady disintegration of the Congress. I think those two are very closely related, including in the period of the 1980s. And what the Congress failed to do in terms of being able to convert the elite project of the Constitution into a tool of political mobilization at the grassroots, which opens up the space for the consistent grassroots mobilization that the Parivar does, the Jan Sangh does, the BJP does into the current present moment. And I think that that dialogue is very necessary for us to understand the core argument that you're making about voter demand and the response of the BJP to that voter demand. So I'll stop here. Lots more to say, but for another conversation.
Vinay, take some more questions and then I'll give you some time to respond. So Sanjay Ruperelia has been asking, Vinay, what evidence does exist that shows Hindu nationalism was demanded in the early 1980s? Did Indra and the Sangh Parivar not manufacture such anxieties, at least exploit them? And second is basically what is striking about the BJP since the 1980s is the will to power, which you were also talking about, that they go to like municipal elections and sort of like, campaign there. So those are two comments from him. Then something perhaps is in your book and you didn't sort of like mention in your presentation, which is the role of Vajpayee and Advani in the late 90s, basically reaching out to smaller political parties and forming the larger NDA, which in some ways helped BJP to gain some sort of like national traction, at least ideologically, and perhaps grow as a political party. And one more question, which is basically what is happening in the Northeast, which is not subject of your book, but basically now BJP presenting itself as a secular party in Northeast for some sections and then pushing its own ideological agendas. So let's take these three questions plus Yamini's questions, and you have 5 minutes to answer. 5 minutes, Vinay.
Thank you, Rahul. This sounds like a thesis viva, but theek hai. So one is...
I wanted to have a scholarly discussion.
Yeah, no, fair enough. No. And these are all excellent questions. So let me just begin with Yamini's argument of Hindu nationalism and violence. And, perhaps because I can read Yamini's mind for the last decade, I actually, let me just tell you, read out from my from the conclusion, because I've taken a lot of effort in this book not to give you my ideological view, right? You know me, you may have figured it out, but the book is not that question, right? Nonetheless, the only judgment that I give in this book, the only judgment, right? And let me just read out. While this book, and this is the conclusion, while this book generally desists from value judgment, it is clear-cut about the BJP's complicity in this violence, dealt with in chapters 7 to 11, and especially in chapter 16, right? So I spend a lot of energy on this question, right? Nonetheless, as you correctly pointed out, Yamini, I complicate the relationship between the BJP's victory and violence in the following ways, right? I show you, for example, how there is a link, and Steve Wilkinson, Rahul Dhatiwala, Briggs, a lot of them have shown, and of course, earlier ethnographic work from Paul Brass and this is actually a very well-studied field of political science, so I don't add anything new to it. I've told you my new arguments, but this is not my argument. This is, a lot of scholars have done, Amrita Basu, for example, have done excellent work on this question, right? But I just complicate it in two ways. One is that a lot of critics of the BJP think that violence is why they win, right? That's a slightly different causal explanation from saying that the BJP's role in communal violence, right? And I asked around, and again, these are informal conversations. I reached out to many of the scholars I cited, and I said, do you have evidence of that causation, right? That but for violence, the BJP wouldn't have won. And they said, no. The scholarship does not answer that question, right? So while, and as I point out here, everyone who looks at the BJP must look at it when it comes to violence. To say that the reason the BJP wins is principally because of violence, which is outside the norms of democratic politics, is wrong. And sometimes I worry that it becomes an excuse from mobilizing to defeat the BJP on election day, right? That's, to me, that's the point one, right? Point two is I point out that from the origins of the BJP, of Hindu nationalism itself, Hegdewar, the founder of the RSS, was deeply impacted by the Nagpur communal religious violence in the early 1920s. He was deeply impacted by the Malabar or the Mopla rebellion in early 20th century, where Muslim tenants attacked Hindu Nair landlords, initially for economic reason, but it also took on a religious symbolism. And for a very long time, Hindu nationalism has had this insecurity that on the street, the Hindu is unable to be martial enough to defeat the Muslim, right? It's an old paranoia, right? And so for them, this idea of defensive violence on the street, when Muslims are attacking Hindus, they need an organization. Now, the historical veracity of this is out of the question, is a different question. We can debate that, right? But it's embedded, this fear is embedded in the psyche of Hindu nationalism. There's no question. But equally, the idea that this alone explains the BJP's rise, or this even explains the BJP's rise, I would push back against, right? That there is no evidence on. The second question you asked is that, how important is the disintegration of the Congress? I think it's very important. Unfortunately, I don't add anything new to the existing literature on that, which is that the disintegration of the Congress politically beginning in 1967, but in terms of social basis by the early 1980s, is something that I haven't been able to understand, right? And that's not, frankly, the focus of the book. But to repeat, Yamini, even whatever reasons we give for the decline of the Congress, the fact that it is the BJP that would emerge as the alternative was not given. That the field was open with this vacuum created for a variety of political entrepreneurs. Variety of political entrepreneurs do attempt to take this mobile ex-Congress vote bank. Why is it that it's the BJP which wins, right? So that's the way I structure the question. But as you said, I don't know the answer to this, right? And it's I guess a deeper answer, which is that, was it because the project of secularism itself was elite or alien to India? Was it because they didn't follow up the constitution and an ideology with an organization to transform Indian society? I don't know the answer to that, right? Now, coming to Sanjay Ruparelia's question, he begins by asking, did Indira Gandhi foment this Hindu anxiety or did she exploit it? So my book, Sanjay, argues that she didn't create it, but she was far smarter than Vajpayee in understanding these currents and in exploiting it. So I show you in the book that in 1983, around 1983, Indira Gandhi plays the Hindu card in the Jammu and Kashmir state elections to tell the region's Hindus that you should be with me to protect yourself from the Muslim National Conference of Farooq Abdullah. For example, she goes to temples, she uses religious symbolism, and the othering of Khalistanis is part of this idea of capturing the Hindu vote bank. And the RSS notices, which is why I point out in the book, in the late 1984 elections, the RSS completely transforms its support and sympathy for Rajiv Gandhi. They even talk about it in the organizer soon after. Nanaji Deshmukh even tells the RSS cadre, please vote for Rajiv Gandhi rather than Vajpayee. Some of that is personal animosity, but some of it is, it seems that Rajiv is better understanding this radical Hindu vote bank than Atal Bihari Vajpayee is. You then ask about coalition dharma, Sanjay. I'm glad you asked it because you're the expert on the third front. And when you read the book, you'll see that, since you're the only person who's written a book on the subject, I cite you on that. I think there's no question that Vajpayee and Advani reach out to allies basically between 1996 and 1999, right? This is the period in which they go from untouchable to touchable. And I show you, I have a full chapter called Untouchables where I show you how they go about this. It's Vajpayee, not Advani. But a deep reason for this, of course, is Vajpayee's charisma, his charm, the fact that he spent 40 to 50 years in parliament and has relations with the opposition. But it's also because after so many governments are formed, the first Vajpayee government, the two governments you write about in your book, the Devegowda government, the Gujarat government, and the second Vajpayee government, the allies realized that there's no possibility of a non-Congress government coming to power in India that does not include the BJP. Right? So this weary realization on the part of Jayalalitha or Trinamool Congress is part of the reason the allies finally moved to the BJP, as much as it is the personal charm of Vajpayee and his statements that the three core issues of 370, etc., will not be part of the National Democratic Alliance agenda, right? You then ask about the BJP and the Northeast that, is it chimera-like, in appealing to different segments in a different way? Yes, and this has been going on for the last 70 years. So, the first half of the book shows you that the Jansangh from 1951 all the way really to 1984, 1985, which is by the time it becomes the BJP, is very careful to remain within the parliamentary consensus on most issues, on foreign policy, on economics, etc., because on the core issue of the relationship between Hinduism and the state, it's outside the parliamentary consensus, right? So it's shown itself to be very adaptable, right, to the immediate tactics of gaining acceptability, coming to power. And it's been doing this for 70 years. And part of the reason, as I point out in the book, is because it worships elections, right? It'll do what it takes to win elections.
Thank you, Vinay, for taking only 1 minute extra. So because we are missile power buddies of decade old, I get the right to sort of tease you as well as trouble you. So let me sort of put an alternative theory of why is not the rise of the BJP, but your 100-year of rise of BJP. So Hindu nationalism or RSS basically begins in 1925. So does almost every other political formation in India, right? DK, Justice Party was formed in 1970, Self-Respect Movement in 1925, Communist Party is formed in 1925, Akali Dal is formed in 1923. So of course, when elections are starting, political players will start. Hindu nationalism in that sense is not an aberration to that thing. The second my alternative narrative would be is when right begins in India's electoral politics, they begin as a fragmented space, right? So you have a Hindu Mahasabha, Ram Rajya Parishad, Bharatiya Jansangh, Gantantra Parishad, in fact, Congress O, right? So all of these players, as Professor Khilnani pointed out, were small marginal players for 40 years of electoral politics. What happens slowly is because these forces realize that by being split or stand alone, they don't get a chance to win election. So what happens in 1950s is Ram Rajya Parishad and Hindu Mahasabha and BJS come together. In 1960s, Swatantrata Party joins. In 1970s, the Congress O faction joined. So in 1980, when BJP is born, it's sort of a coalition of all right-wing forces. So you get 20% of BJP in 1989, not because of anything else, but because all these smaller forces, which were 5%, 6%, 3% in 1950s and 60s, basically sort of like, came together in 1990s. And my third and sort of like short point would be, and your thesis advisor, Atul Kohli, in one of his books, right? Like whenever you do a historical work, the job of the scholar is to basically decide where to begin the causal chain. In your case, in your argument, you begin the causal chain in 1981, which is basically building up of Hindu anxiety after 19 Meenakshi Puram temple. And the point I was making, like in like the first point and second point, is basically shows the causal chain goes much back, and what you see in 1980s is just a sort of like a culmination of all those forces. So just those 2 points, and you have 30 seconds. Sorry, just 2 minutes, and try to wrap up.
Okay, very quickly. One, these are all excellent questions. So they're not teasing questions because they're very good ones, right? And it's hard for me to tease back. So one is that you point out that, look, what with the creation of the Hindu Mahasabha as a separate party, RSS in the 1920s is not unique. Other parties are doing it. And you're absolutely right? That's part of the argument of the book, that in a group-based society, when you introduce elections, you will get groups redefining themselves, groups trying to form social coalitions. You don't get individuals with interests, right? So in that sense, and what the core of that argument is actually not to show you why the BJP is unique, right? The core of that argument for me is to show you why the BJP is not unique, right? And in that sense, it's a natural response of a group-based society to the opportunities presented by elections. So while what you're saying, absolutely I agree. And then why the BJP wins is, to me, then an organizational story, right? Because the founding idea is not fascist in that sense. It's the same, it's what the DK is doing, it's what the Justice Party is doing, it's what the Akalis are doing, for exactly the reason that you mentioned. It's just that the BJP has been able to conjure up the biggest vote bank of them all. The second point, which is a deep one, and I think I haven't thought about this, which is the core argument you're trying to make is that, look, the right-wing vote base in India has always been about 20%. And the first bloom of the BJP is merely its consolidation, right? Rather than anything else. Is that a correct summary of that argument?
Yes.
And that's a good point, right? And let me just put it this way. One is, why do they consolidate behind the Jansangh, right? Why? There's so many other parties out there. Why is it the party backed by the RSS? As you know, the Ram Rajya Party, the Swatantra Party, the Hindu Mahasabha were all not backed by the RSS. And to me, that answer is organization, right? It's organizational unity. For example, the Hindu Mahasabha, prior to independence, Savarkar, who was the president for a while, desperately wanted RSS support, and Golwalkar said no, right? And I think in part, that's why they lose. It's not the only reason they lose, but in part, that's why they lose to the Congress Party and Mahatma Gandhi, right? In the first elections in India, the 1951-52 one, again, to give credence to your question, the Jansangh is not the number one Hindu party in terms of seats. I think that's the Ram Rajya Party, but it's the number one Hindu party in terms of vote share. And immediately, once you move to the 1957-62 elections, there's no question that it's, the primary party of political or radical Hinduism is the Jansangh backed by the RSS. And all of these are really only fringe parties, right? But that's certainly an interesting question that you asked, that, that it's this was always a radical, the radical politics was always there in India. And the question then becomes, why did it consolidate in the 80s? And, as I point out in the book, the consolidation was not for the BJP to begin with. It was for the Congress Party, right? And then it finds utterance when it comes to the BJP after Rath Yatra, after the Palanpur Declaration, accepting Ayodhya. But that's a good point, right? The third point you ask, and that I want to push back a little bit upon, is why do I begin the causal chain for the rise of the BJP in the 1980s, right? And I think the answer to that, and there I'm a little more confident, is that the 1970s had a very different mood in India, right? And Vajpayee, correctly in my opinion, understood that voters were not rejecting Indraism, all right, or the Congressism. They were rejecting Indira Gandhi. He understood that, right? And he understood that if the Jan Sangh, the Hindu nationalists, had to mainstream themselves, they had to mainstream itself by merging with the larger parliamentary opposition, which was socialist and secular, and far away from the Hindu vote bank. And I argue in the book that this analysis of Vajpayee, which was right in the 1970s, so he was right in rejecting and removing Balraj Madhok from the party, right? It was precisely the wrong analysis of India in the 1980s. And Indira Gandhi sees it before Vajpayee, the RSS and VHP see it before Vajpayee. Even Vajpayee's biggest loyalist, Lal Krishna Advani, sees it before Vajpayee, right? Which is why, to me, the sort of the 1980 election or even the 1977 election is the big break. And I think Indira Gandhi is correct in noticing that in 1977, when the Janata Party comes to power, it's not a coincidence that the Jan Sangh is the single largest component of the Janata Party, right? There's already a Hindu vote bank slowly being created, and Indira Gandhi, who like Modi has a better feel for ground level politics than Vajpayee and Advani, was able to sense and smell this much better than Vajpayee, which is why the story begins in the 1980s. But look, all causal explanations, especially when they're in part driven by these long durée forces, there always tends to be a cutoff, and you can criticize it. So that's and you know this better than anyone else, but that's a fair question.
Yeah. Thank you, Vinay, and thank you, Yamini and Professor Khilnani and everyone who joined us today. This was a fascinating conversation. I certainly learned a lot, though there are reasons to disagree with some of the argument, but that's the nature of scholarly debates and the enterprise. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we will perhaps now meet next year with new authors and new books. We know that perhaps at the moment, idea of India is under constraint. The future of idea of India is going to be now written in the next year. So see you all then. Thank you everyone for joining. Bye-bye.